Hey Ryan, how are you doing today?
I'm wonderful. How are you?
I'm doing really great. I've been really looking forward to this conversation. I'm really grateful for the work and some of the things you've offered me with the of what you've shared, and I'm excited to explore some of that in some more detail and connect with you today. So I've been really looking forward to it all day. And I did think of a question I wanted to start with. We've been asking a few of our guests this, and I was curious how it would land with you. So this theme of absorption has been coming up a lot, like feeling absorbed and feeling, yeah, like in flow or something like this. And we've been chatting with some of our previous guests if they would be willing to, and I was curious if you would do this too, if you would be willing to look back into the kind of story of Ryan, into your history, and maybe look backwards as an adolescent, or as a younger person. Did you Are there any memories of things that really gripped you or absorbed you, that you'd be willing to share any of those memories with us today?
Oh, sure.
Great.
Interesting. It's interesting. I don't know if I've ever approached it with the word absorb.
Mm,
It's like sort of interconnectedness
mhm,
type of thing. Uh, let's see. When I was younger, um, there was a lot of disconnect in a lot of ways. I think it's fair to say. When I was younger, a lot of anger and stress. The usual human dilemma uh, in growing up. But let's see, times I felt absorbed. I'd say skateboarding. I was a big skateboarder, and I loved just flowing through the streets and cities and being creative. And uh, I could kind of, when I was out skating, I could just put down all the melodrama of the human experience with the family stuff and uh, school and all, just so many different things. I'd go out and just kind of be in my own world, listen to music, and yeah, I'd say that was one of my first kind of meditations actually was skateboarding. Uh, Another one would be guitar. I also love playing guitar, and it's another one I found when I would pick up the guitar, it would be a great way to just kind of step out of myself almost. But then I just feel very connected to things. Uh, is that anything?
that's great.
I think
Yeah,
okay.
there's definitely something coming alive when you talk about both the connection to skateboarding, feeling like really absorbed in skateboarding and like listening to music, and then also playing the guitar. It's interesting. I'm curious what you make of this. Many folks have talked about the combination of like music or some kind of athletics as being something that
Ah,
really absorbed them from a young age. And I'm just really curious about that. Do you see, kind of fast forwarding way ahead to the now, to right now, into your current practice, or your how you currently experience presence, which I know is a word you talk about a lot. I mean, do you see any of those themes of like music and athletics coming up? I don't know. I sometimes, when I have this image in my head of meditation or spiritual practice, it's often very still and very silent, which can be
mm.
extremely beautiful. But do you think there's a place for more active expressions of presence, and is that something that you're currently doing, or you see a space for? What do you think?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think that's the to me presence, the ultimate expression of presence is the integration. I mean, it's lovely to experience stillness, seated silently, but it's not quite practical.
Mm,
You can't just. I mean, it'd be great if you could just sit and be still for, I don't know, maybe. I also really enjoy being active though, right? And music is still very, very much a close thing to me. The new Chili Peppers album that just came out is just so delicious. And actually, the Chili Peppers was one of the first bands I remember. One of the first CDs I ever got was Californication, and just being immersed in that beautifulness of that art. Uh, it's just such a lovely thing. So yeah, music is still very close to me. Even, I mean, yeah, with presence, it's like it's an added layer to make the present moment beautiful. I feel like, um, Let's see though. Although at the same time, I very much appreciate silence. Yeah, interestingly. So kind of a bit of both, or just the sounds of nature. Um, as far as active, I'm not as active as I used to be. When I was first getting into these practices, I was like really into Spartan races, this like mud courses, and
Wow.
yeah, it was fun. I loved being physically active, and I found, that I could exercise and kind of be in that meditative state at the same time, clear your head. I chant mantras or something, different things. Really love that. And skateboarding certainly was very active. I mean, sports, I think, very often can be meditative. It can all, ego can sneak in anywhere though, too. Like when I used to play guitar, I'd sit there and sometimes I'd get lost in my head about, imagining being this famous rock star and going on that trip of things. And so it wasn't about playing the guitar as much as it was about an image of Ryan being cool, where the ego sneaks in. So I think the ego can sneak in a lot of these different attributes too, but at the same time, I think it can be really beautiful. And dancing, I mean, I love dancing. Actually, so when I was first getting into this practice of presence, I was 22, 23. And for a few years, I was really only able to kind of rest in the stillness when I was physically still. And then I tried yoga. And I realized yoga was a nice kind of medium because the movement was slow enough and very mindful, uh, and yet challenging, physically challenging, um, that I found it to be a good combination of learning how to move while feeling still, while being still. And then that gradually kind of actually melded more into not even just moving slowly in like yoga practice, but like running and doing training like burpees, a bunch of burpees for Spartan races, and carrying giant rocks and all that kind of stuff. So then it kind of helped me realize that I don't have to physically be still to be in stillness. And that actually allowed me to start bringing it into my work. I used to work in kitchens, so I brought it into that environment, and I started bringing it into different things, driving and all kinds of stuff. But yeah.
Thanks, Ryan. Very, very interesting to hear you reflect on this kind of this interesting invitation to be present and embody some presence while being active. I'm curious. So it's kind of circling back many fascinating things in what you just shared about ego and stillness and activity that hopefully we can get into. But you mentioned getting into yoga, and I think you said in your early 20s. And so I'm just wanting to connect something that you said. So when you were younger, there were a lot of moments of kind of stress and anger and things, and maybe suffering a lot that many of us are experiencing. And then you talked about like doing yoga and some of your practices. What kind of planted the seed that you could do something about the suffering that you're experiencing? I'm just kind of assuming, maybe correct me if I'm wrong, but like that the yoga and the practices you're picking up were, many of us are doing them to help out with suffering. Was that the case with you, or what kind of led you to this, maybe this idea of maybe practicing yoga, maybe sitting in stillness, trying to be more present? What was that like for you?
Yeah, big question. Well, as often, fortunate or unfortunately, for me, it was the suffering that brought me to this path of self-inquiry and really making peace a priority. Yeah, when I was 21, I was in a lot of suffering. I mean, yeah, just I'd say unfortunately common human dilemma of like sort of depression, a lot of anger, a lot of resentments, and just unhealed wounds. And I was, at that age, like I was really chill on the outside, but as people knew, like when I got angry, it was a mess, and it would like come out all at once type of thing, kind of calm like a bomb. Uh, and it was so let's see. Yeah, the suffering just kept building and building. And I remember it was interesting. I was 21. I had just become a kitchen manager, which in my bubble of life was like a big deal because I got this big promotion and I was making more money than I'd ever made before. And it was on the outside, I was kind of on top of things, but inside, it kind of just became boring and stagnant and like missing purpose. And money didn't interest me enough, to only work for money. And uh, just that kind of stuff combined with this other layers of suffering. I was at a really kind of low space, and I think my mom just kind of picked up on that, and she was like, "Have you heard of Eckhart Tolle?" And I was, no, and she's like, "Well, I've just found this book of his, and it's really interesting, but it's honestly kind of I don't quite get it, but you might like it." And I was like, "Okay, sure." So I checked it out, and at first I was hesitant. Uh, but I just, I was desperate enough for some answers. So, so I read it through it, and it just all of a sudden started making a lot of sense. Uh, Especially when I had this moment of cessation from my own thoughts, uh, the silence, or even the awareness that, oh, there's a mind that's talking. I'm talking to myself all the time. The sort of realization of hearing the voice in my head, just something about it just relieved so much heaviness, so much stress. Uh, and I guess that's what you call like the awakening, it's kind of the mystical specialness. I don't even like kind of using those words, but it felt really good. It felt like a huge weight was just suddenly gone. And that's when I kind of got hooked. I was like, oh, there's something to this. And so then I just went deeper and deeper. I quit. I even remember like quitting my job and just studying as much as it was like this spiritual awakening path, Eckhart Tolle, meditation, stillness. To me, it was like the best high I could find. A high better than the drugs and whatnot. Uh, and so in a way, I could say I kind of dig, like I jumped into it so deeply, and it just felt right. It just felt so good. How could I argue with the peace and the bliss I was starting to experience from studying these things? And that's really what kind of hooked me. And then from there, I just kept exploring the rabbit holes, and really enjoying that adventure of. There's so many amazing teachers and styles and insights and aha moments to unravel. And it's just felt like a really satisfying adventure, uh, ever since that part. And the suffering, at first I had this sort of huge relief of the suffering for a little while. I don't even know how long it lasted, a month or two. And then like the suffering started coming back in. The pain body, as Eckhart calls it, these ego patterns, the fears, all this different stuff started trickling back in. and that's when I kind of feel like the work began of the just constantly doing the practices of like inquiry and calling out my own reactivity uh and doing all this healing work. Really, it's a slow kind of painful process in different ways, but slowly but surely just kept going, and I realized that I was experiencing less and less suffering. As I was addressing each suffering that arose, uh, I could start to really work on and heal whatever was showing up in each moment, and eventually things stopped showing up as much. And it's nice. I'm very grateful.
That's great, Ryan. Thank you. Really cool to hear that context from your journey, your journey, and that's interesting. So what I was hearing is that you kind of got this promotion to be kitchen manager, and that seemed while you're speaking, that seemed to be it revealed itself to me as a bit of a catalyst. I think a lot about in my journey about like seeking, and like I'll go for something like a promotion, and then you talked about like kind of getting it and then it feeling stagnant and not really. There's something for me about the seeking that's almost better than the getting. Like I
Yep.
got the promotion, and that's, correct me if I'm wrong, but that seemed to be like a bit of a catalyst, and your mom actually picked up on some of the suffering you were going through and introduced you to Eckhart Tolle. And I have to thank you, Ryan. just recently in the last 3 months since I found your YouTube channel, finished that book, and it's The Power of Now.
Oh, nice.
And it's interesting. It's like so popular. Like I thought I knew about it. Like I just was like thought I don't know. I just never thought to read it because I'd heard so much about it. And then I read through this book, and it's high. If you're one of the people like me who haven't read it yet, strong recommend for me because there's very pragmatic psychology in it and very oriented around healing. And I just really loved it. And you definitely got me onto that, Ryan. So thank you for encouraging me to read that book. And so that seemed that the discovery of that book seemed. Was it that book? Was it The Power of Now? Or,
Yeah,
okay.
that was the one. That was the first one that
Mhm.
ignited it all.
Great. And do you want to tell us maybe a little bit, because then you talked about how um, there was kind of a release, a recognition that, thoughts in the mind, I don't know, aren't real, or I don't know how you would explain it, or just, I had a realization recently. I work a lot with self-criticism, and
uh,
I was doing this meditation, and I realized that I was listening to the self-criticism. I was like, oh, like this, I don't have to listen to this. Like, I don't have to do what this is saying, which was like saying, like, stop meditating, you're not doing it well. Like, look on the internet. I was like, no, I'm not doing that. I'm just going to keep breathing. It's fine. And that for me was a major release. I was like, oh, that voice is just there. And I don't know, it seems so simple when describing it, but the felt sense of it was quite potent. It seems like you experienced something similar. I don't know. What was your realization there? So somewhat similar to that, or would you be willing to talk more about that moment that you had about the kind of recursive thoughts a little bit? Would you be willing to flesh that out a little for us?
yeah, absolutely. It's a
Great.
great subject. Yeah, I mean, on one level, it's like hard to find words. It's the paradox. On another, uh, one of the main things I remember feeling when it first really hit me was this deep sense of love and of like a natural forgiveness. Like I just suddenly understood very deeply that no one can act beyond where they're at. And a lot of the resentments I had were boiling inside me from everything, family and friends and random kids at school and on and on and on. Society. I used to be very critical and judgmental of our society, of the current state of humanity and all these things. And there was just this huge release of just forgiving everything, and that included myself. Forgiving myself has been and was a huge piece as well. Of course, it's all actually quite connected, the self. But let's see. With the one of the quotes from Eckhart I love, and yet it's taken. It's funny how Eckhart's teachings can, or any of these presence teachings type of things can, you hear them and they make sense and they feel good, and then you hear them again and there's a little bit deeper, and it gets a little bit deeper and a little bit deeper. There's one of his quotes that's, here's a new spiritual practice for you. Don't take your thoughts too seriously. And that, like, it's so potent. Like, it seems simple. It seems like, oh yeah, cool. But actually underneath that is enlightenment. Because the disidentification from mind, which is where ego happens, is identification with our thoughts. When you start to not take your thoughts so seriously, you are still aware of them. You're hearing, like, if you have self judgments and stuff, self criticisms, first step is to become aware of them. That way they're not wreaking havoc behind us in the unconscious, still affecting our physiological experience. When we first, bringing awareness is very important. And then second is the identification, to really know deep in ourselves that you are not the voice that is criticizing. That's just conditioning. It's just conditioning often from our families, but also from the society around us and so on. And the more you feel that, the less power it has, even if it's going, even if that narrative of self-criticism is happening, the less you take it seriously, the less it actually is a reality in any way. right? Because you're not giving it power. And when you stop giving it power long enough, it kind of burns itself out and then no longer comes in, right? Which is kind of the, I guess, the intention of working through any of this stuff, is to actually transcend it, or get rid of it in a good way, not in a repressing way. But so yeah, to recognize, I think an important aspect too is when you hear those thoughts happening, just being able to hear those thoughts is an accomplishment. And you can very easily dissolve the self-judgment thing when you simply are recognizing, oh, I'm hearing you, or I'm hearing that thought. That's an accomplishment. That's your consciousness expanding, getting closer and deeper into presence, because it takes consciousness, it takes presence to hear whatever's going on in you. So anytime you hear that, your consciousness expands. And then the key is to hold that listening, though, because what ends up happening where we can fall back in is like, okay, you hear that critical thought, and then you notice the thought. So you kind of stepped into awareness in that moment. But then a second layer comes in now where you're commenting about having noticed that first critical thought. And so immediately on that second layer, the mind, the self of thought has come in through that second door now as the commenter of like, oh, damn it, I'm not supposed to be thinking, I'm not supposed to be having these thoughts, which is what? That's just more criticism. It's really, it becomes a really subtle art to just keep stepping back, to keep just to know yourself as that silent observer. And any sound, any noise, any words that come in is of mind. And that's what I started to come to realize more and more. But and eventually, a lot of I didn't have, well, I guess I did have some self-criticism. I think we often can be kind of on this perfectionism thing, which is, you want to be careful of, because it's not really, I've learned it's really important not to make it about perfection at all, just about progress. Just a little step here, a little step there is wonderful. It's more than wonderful. And it's also a mechanism of the mind with comparison, which then makes us feel less than or more than another. To let go of comparison is really powerful too, to really just appreciate where we are and where everyone else is, and like not, making one less or more than anyone else. Yeah. Does that answer the question? I don't know. Kind of went around in different
No,
areas.
it's great, Ryan. Thank you. Yeah, just on the comparison point, I recently heard a proverb: "Comparison is the thief of joy," and it really struck me because this comparison thing. I mean, your description and kind of how you painted the picture of, okay, on one hand, it's recognizing and celebrating the accomplishment of being aware of some of these self-critical thoughts, or just mind in general, whatever it's coming up with. We're using the case study of self-critical thoughts, but even generalizing that out to any kind of activity of mind, that's a huge accomplishment. But then there's you did this great description of like that second layer that comes in, and like it's just it's so maddening. But this idea of being self-critical about self-criticism, like I'm still, it's just this twisted knot. And I think that is a really interesting gateway into some of what you said about ego. And maybe from your perspective, from Eckhart's perspective, what is ego? And I maybe want to prime this a little bit, because I just loved this thing you said earlier about the skateboarder. Like, we'll use the skateboarder like archetype, and you said that even, or maybe playing guitar too, the musician archetype, that sometimes it's easy to slip out of just being in the flow of playing the guitar and kind of having an image of, I'll use myself as a person playing the guitar, this kind of weird kind of hologram or virtual. I hadn't heard it quite said like that, but that my lived experience, I definitely work with that phenomenon of kind of being almost disembodied from the activities I'm doing and imagining
Mm.
other people looking at me in whatever role I'm playing. And I don't know, would you call it, first of all, would you call that ego? And maybe even if you want to generalize out and give us a little bit of your understanding of what this term means, I think it could be really, really helpful. What do you think? Do you want to take a shot at that?
Yeah, gladly. Well, I think for me, where it became ego was I was more concerned with people thinking I'm a great guitarist than me enjoying playing guitar. And and I mean, to take one of my favorite guitarists, Jimi Hendrix, he's just a master of this art, but he played, you could just feel it, like he played out of love. He loved music and he loved the instrument, and he was also quite humble and wasn't, well, it's hard to really say, but it seemed like he wasn't all that lost in what other people thought about him and just really being himself. And it's kind of like you're saying, the hologram type of thing. It's very elusive. I don't know. It's a tricky little thing. I don't know exactly how to point at it, other than one level of ego is just this, how our mind will constantly try and cultivate or control how others interpret us, how they see us, how are you interpreting me, and then putting me into a box in your mind is like, okay, that's Ryan Astheimer, he's this and this and that. And this self-image thing, we have one of ourselves, of what we think of ourselves and feel of ourselves, and then there's one that everyone else has of us, which probably might be quite different, each person. But that in and of itself is like a one layer of where ego happens, because it's all an illusionary thing, really. Like, I just am right here. This is me right here. All the extra stuff, all the labels, all the words, all the concepts, that's where ego can tend to proliferate. And partly because what we then do as well is we like to get little trophies and put them in our self-image boxes, of like, I'm the accomplished guitarist, and I did this thing and I've got that thing. And it's satisfying temporarily, but how you when it's ego, for one, is that it never completely satisfies. It's insatiable. There's always something else that needs more of, when and it tends to thrive in the comparison realm too, of like, I don't know, as a male, often the whole being fit thing is that, having muscles and comparing ourselves to others. And I always thought it was intriguing how these guys that had just giant muscles and stuff, it seemed like they were only comparing themselves to the guys with bigger muscles. and or whatever it is, the money, you want to have the money. And I noticed, like, no matter how good you are at something or how much you build yourself up on something, there will always be somebody with more, or that's better, that sacrificed more for a particular thing. And it's an exhausting game. And when I felt the exhaustion of it, I felt more naturally willing to just put it all down and be me. Just be whatever happens when I'm being, in a sense. But let's see. There was something else you asked in that question. The ego. How I define ego, so to speak. Yeah, it's a cunning little word. It's 3 letters, but it's very, very deep. I've found there's a lot of different definitions to it, a lot of different angles or different levels of depth to it. When I first heard the word ego, I really didn't know what it was. I kind of attached it to just people that were like sort of macho image, like really overconfident type of thing. Like, that to me was ego. But then, Eckhart brought in that there are many layers to ego, and more important, actually, one really important thing about ego is it's always much more profound to find our own than it is to point at someone else's. And anytime you catch yourself thinking or feeling like, oh, that person has such a big ego, well, that's your ego, because that's judgment. uh, uh, so one little thing there, but okay. So definitions of ego. One is identification with form. So identification with physical body, identification with even form as in skills. All of our skills happen on the form world, whether I'm good at yoga or skateboarding or guitar. Well, that's all on the surface of reality. That's all form stuff. And so if I was identified with that, if I defined myself as any of those particular skills, then you could say that there's ego that. And so identification with form is one. Now, a form actually also, this is a bit trickier, it's a more elusive, but form is actually also happens in mind. Thoughts are forms, and beliefs are forms, and opinions are forms. And so on a deeper level, where the ego happens is all these identifications we have with the labels that we carry or that we're even proud of. Being identified, even like to what sports team I like, or what political side I lean on, or my religious beliefs, any mental concepts that we attach to being, okay, this is me, this is Ryan, on one end could be ego. And I guess an important thing here, though, is that to have a body doesn't mean you're an ego. It's the identification with it that becomes ego. Just like having a political opinion isn't necessarily ego, actually. It's when your sense of self gets locked in there or entangled, then it becomes ego. And the way you can help figure out if there's ego or not, there's a couple like practical measures that I found really helpful. One of which is defensiveness. Anytime you become aware in yourself defensiveness, there's ego at play. And because it's like, if again, let's say political side, it's a hot topic. So if you're identifying with a particular political side, when someone on the opposite point of view is expressing something of an opposite opinion, if you're identified with your side, then that person's opposite opinion is going to feel threatening, because they're not just threatening your idea, they're threatening you because you are in that idea. And this is where so much conflict and argument stuff happens. So defensiveness, anytime you become aware of defensiveness, then egos come in. Another really helpful one is feeling superior or inferior to anyone, physically, even spiritually, monetarily, economically, all these different things that we compare ourselves with. Whenever you feel less than or more than anyone else, then ego is happening. Because another definition of ego is a sense of separation. This part of us that's identified as being this separate little being in this world of separation. That's also kind of one of the roots of ego. And whenever we feel bigger than someone or less than someone, it means we've lost that deeper knowing of equality. That is, the non-separated reality is equal. So that's the really practical one, and it can sneak in a lot of tricky ways. Like, even, let's say, a spiritual teacher, if I really love Eckhart, to be able to learn from him and yet at the same time not feel less than him is really important. He doesn't want you to feel less than him. He's constantly teaching that, and he emanates this knowing that we're all equal here. But when I first started studying him, something in me felt inferior, because here's a spiritual teacher, they're supposed to be up on this pedestal or something. That's what my mind did. It's not what he was playing, but that's what my mind was playing. And so it can even happen on the spiritual level, but it also happens, back with this comparison thing of like, how often, how much do we compete with our forms, going back to identification with form. If I think I'm really muscular and there's some skinnier guy, I get this little boost of power, of confidence, because I'm I'm stronger than that guy. But then someone else walks over and is twice as big, and now I suddenly feel diminished because I'll never be that big. Uh, that, I mean, it happens with money, it happens with skill sets, it happens, I mean, just we find so many things to play this game with, it seems like. But yeah, so defensiveness. And another one that's pretty potent is actually suffering. Anytime we become aware of suffering in us, it means there's some ego at play. Ego, I realized after a few years that ego and suffering, there's a strong correlation. But I'd also throw in here that ego isn't wrong. It doesn't mean you've failed or made a mistake or anything like that. It's just simply a spot lacking awareness. And when you have the right tools and perspectives to catch these pockets of ego, you can then dissolve them and be free of them. But you can't dissolve them until you first acknowledge them, catch them, work with them. I think that's an important thing too, is at first I kind of treated this whole ego thing as like the big enemy, the a big problem or something. And it became easier when I started recognizing it more as just this byproduct of nature. And it's not some big bad guy. It's just one of the sort of side effects of the evolution in nature that we have to work with and do our best to learn from. And yeah, there's a lot more to ego, really. It's a huge subject, but maybe that's a little intro.
Yeah, awesome intro. Very, very helpful. So the first of all, loving that definition, that ego as identification with form, which just that sentence alone, I think, really unpacks and is really interesting idea. And then you also gave us some really pragmatic and helpful and things I'm very curious about, like techniques almost, or practices to, notice where defensiveness comes up, notice where this one between really jumped out to me about superiority and inferiority, especially the inferior one. Because I don't know, that intuitively that does seem right to me, but I haven't really thought of it like that. It's almost like I am catching myself or thinking of myself now as remembering myself getting kind of caught in a loop where like my response to feeling superior, which happens, is to like make myself feel inferior. Whereas,
yeah, sort of like the overly humble, like, yeah,
as opposed to becoming aware of the superiority and just noting it. Maybe it could be another path that I'll experiment with it. So I'm grateful for that one. That idea, and then and I think, and then circling back to what you said about like the bodybuilders, and so like for example, this podcast is named Peace Now, and I realized about a year ago that one of the values I'm going for is peace. Like I really want peace in my life, but I realized that my actions were actually leading, like their object was peace, but it was like work a lot to get a lot of money so you can be at peace, instead of just realizing like, wait a second, I've reached this level of skill set where I can kind of just do it and then just chill out on the weekends, and it's fine to like, I don't have to keep striving and seeking for this next step that everyone around me is going for, because my goal is peace, and that's where I just want to kind of chill out. Like that's what I really want. And that to me was very, very radical. I mean, I'm just always curious about things. Like I also have an athletic background, and I realized that I like to have fun. Like, and at a certain level of competitive rigor, it's really not fun. Like it's probably not that fun to be a professional athlete. Like if you really think about it, how much fun. There are probably moments of fun, but playing rec league is soccer, which is my sport, is a lot more fun. So I just try to do that. I don't know. So that I'm playing around with that too, and with your first response to like the self image of the self, I want to align my kind of self images with what I kind of actually want, like which is a kind of peace and not necessarily like a striving. And okay, so that was an amazing answer. And so we've talked at great length about ego now, or to some small length about ego. I'm wondering if you would talk now about, and I think this is a really nice segue because you're starting to explore this a little bit, but this term, you used it once, enlightenment. I've also heard awakening. Other terms could probably be used. What is that all about, like in your experience? Like what is enlightenment?
Well, yeah, it's a big subject, a lot of tricky layers to it, but um, simple definition I love and I use is the end of suffering, which was shared by the Buddha. And what it worked with me was I realized, okay, I too really want peace. I want more peace. Oh, and just a little side note, even a peaceful image could get some, the I am peaceful. The ego can sneak in there too. It can sneak in on the spiritual levels. It's a really cunning thing. Not that it's bad, but just something to play with or to notice. The image of being peaceful, but what was I getting at? Oh, enlightenment. Yeah. So the end of suffering. It suddenly hit me that if I want to like reach the end of suffering, then I need to work with my sufferings. I need to look at all my sufferings, no stone left unturned. Look at everything, which gets into then it's like if you're wanting to explore enlightenment and it means the end of suffering, then the question then comes to, well, what is suffering? And really defining suffering, not just conceptually, but like practically, when am I feeling it? When is it happening in me? And what flavors does it take on? And that's when I started to realize how much of my like sort of emotional experiences in life, in this moment, were of suffering, with like anger. And when I became aware that anger was actually not enjoyable, there was something in me that kind of took like a masochistic pleasure out of it. But uh, I started to become, as I started making peace more of my priority and started enjoying the peace, the anger started to feel much more out of contrast, like in contrast, and it's standing out as like not really something I like, not something I enjoy. It's not nearly as tasty as the peace, and or as stable. It gets me in a lot of trouble too. So yeah, I started realizing like, okay, how do I work through anger and then fears and anxiety and stress, impatience, jealousy. I mean, just so many different layers. And so I just started working with each one, right? Acknowledging it when it arises in me, which one big key I've found over these years is this question of constantly asking myself, how do I feel in this moment? And it takes a fierce honesty, because it's not about like, how do I want everyone to think I feel, or what's the right answer supposed to be? It's simply complete honesty of self-awareness, of inner awareness of what's happening in me in this moment. And in this moment, when I check in, is there peace? Or is there any sort of discomfort, unease, uh, sense of resistance? Resistance is another word I found really helpful when exploring suffering, because that's actually like the root of suffering is the resistance. It's something in us that's saying no to reality. Uh, it's interesting is that little equation of saying no to reality is actually like super important. It's a huge key to experiencing more enlightenment. But let's see. So yeah, when I started working more on acknowledging the suffering, which you brought up earlier in the beginning too, that's something you're really interested in, and that's brilliant. You keep acknowledging it, you keep working with it, and you get different insights. You get different realizations and different things that you learn the tools to work with the suffering as it arises. The term pain body is really helpful from Eckhart, that explains how sometimes when suffering hits us, it doesn't match what's happening in front of us. or actually might argue very often when we hit with suffering, it's not actually has to do with anything in front of us. It has to do with something outside of present moment, either in past or in the future. To recognize that is quite powerful, very, very helpful in the moments when that happens. But but with the pain body too, it's really helpful to understand, because when you get sort of overtaken by an intense emotion, to recognize that there's something deeper there than what's occurring, not to blame whatever's triggering it, but to be willing to step back, slow down, breathe, and investigate what's underneath. And surely, slowly in doing that, you start to uncover the deeper reasonings for our sufferings. It could be different for everyone to some degree, but I think often there's quite a lot of common denominators too, like sense of abandonment or never, not feeling good enough or not feeling worthy, all these different deep layers. And bringing awareness in, bringing awareness in is super important. There's also some key factors too, though, where with enlightenment, like a big aspect of my experience has been also this quieting of the mind, been very important, or the disidentifying from thought, disidentifying from mind. And what I've noticed too with this end of suffering is also a lessening of mind, the mind becoming gradually a little bit calmer, a little bit quieter, a little bit more satisfied, and not always just, rambling off in 1,000 directions. And that too comes back to a question of, what am I thinking right now? That's it. You're just noticing any thoughts happening right now. Yeah, it's either yes or no. And becoming aware of that either way is meditation at its root. But when as the identification shifts away from being the mind, being the thoughts, to really deeply knowing yourself as the silent witness, as the observer that's aware, when that becomes more concrete, more solidified, what you're left with is enlightenment. Because enlightenment is actually our natural state. When the layers of ego have peeled away, when we've let go of or worked through all this stuff that was piled on us and that we absorbed unknowingly, unconsciously, conditioned into from birth to this moment. So yeah, I guess little note there. I do feel that enlightenment is actually everyone's deepest natural state. And awakening, another interesting term on awakening is Eckhart shares, is awakening from the dream of thought. Yeah, and it's the mind kind of goes like, but it can't be that simple. It can't be that easy. And yet the mind is still making sure it's involved. The last thing I'd throw in, I actually made a post on my Facebook recently, like publicly sharing that I was enlightened, which is kind of like something you don't normally do. Most teachers don't just flat out publicly say they are. And I know it was a bold move, but it just felt right. Like it felt like, what, it's actually not that big of a deal. I don't experience much suffering anymore. I've done a lot of work, a lot of practice and studies to heal a lot of things. And at this point, I just live a very consistently peaceful life. And why not just, put that out there like, hey, this is, for everyone. And it got some interesting responses. Part of my reason for publicly saying I was enlightened too was, that could be a really tasty ego badge to put on, of like, of, oh, people thinking I'm enlightened, man, that doesn't get better than that. If that was happening. Now, the ironic thing though, if that was true, if ego was at play there, suffering would surely come in, because that's the consequence. Whenever we get lost in ego, suffering is always kind of there to slap us around. So that's how I've measured is to constantly stay aware of myself, of when I feel at peace or if reactivity comes in. And then after, if you go days, weeks without any reactivity coming in, well, that's basically enlightenment. It's very simple. It's nothing. There aren't fireworks and bells and whistles or anything. It's actually fairly simple, but I'd also say it's quite satisfying. It's like this constant state of just feeling really satisfied, or content. And sometimes there's like a really powerful, blissful type of samadhi type of thing. But very often it's more just like a chill, just a very chill state. Now, nowhere to be, nothing to do, no one to be, just kind of being. It's just very pleasant. Yeah.
Thank you for sharing that, Ryan. And maybe a lot of fascinating things that you're talking about, and maybe that kind of declaration you made as being an enlightened person. I mean, I think it feels really juicy to me, and I'm very intrigued by it, because you're talking about how, or I was hearing you talk about, okay, maybe you're kind of examining in your own experience, like, is there ego involved in this declaration or not? And I have this perspective on it where I've been seeing this a lot. Like, I think we're in a very interesting time with like the intersection of spirituality and like social media, and the fact that kind of in a quote unquote late modern context, there's a lot of cross pollination. Many different traditions can intersect. So a lot of like technology is being shared, and technology like practices is what I mean by that. And I think it's a really fertile time, honestly, for these practices. But there's also, I think, some tensions. And so in a lot of the religions I've studied, frankly, like, it is very taboo to say you're an awakened teacher. That's not, you wouldn't do that. That would just be against the code or whatever. And it would be a sure sign that you're not enlightened by saying it. And I'm wondering if there's something to this, because you seem to have just such a interesting, incisive, like, psychological mind. And I think there's something about, like, when you declare yourself as enlightened, you're actually, from what I've seen of the responses of it, there's other teachers who have done this, is I don't think it's as good for the ego, for lack of a better term. Like, I think a lot of the teachers who kind of hold back a little bit on that, they're able to get a lot more projected onto them, almost, if that makes sense. And there's something, I had someone talk to me about the axis of authenticity and approval. And like, if you authentically feel you're enlightened, I mean, if that's value for you, why not just say it, But sometimes that might not lead to approval, people will be like, you're not enlightened, you're blah, blah, blah. Like, all these things can come up. And I almost think that by holding back a little, that might lead to more approval. I mean, it's very kind of abstract thing, but I think part of the religious, quote unquote, religious, I'm not trying to generalize here, but one of the reasons that may have slipped in to a lot of the traditions is because it really leads to a lot more approval of the person who doesn't share, because I don't know, I think you become, it's easier to project onto someone when they're humble. That's just kind of, I'm just kind of throwing that out there, but I'm actually viewing people who are more open about being enlightened, and as long as there's not like a ton of like negative signs, like people are being hurt around them, and it's just, there's obvious, clear, like, narcissistic signs or whatever, I really think that it's a very positive thing to do. And also kind of taking a little bit of the, I don't know, the sexy marketing aspect of it. It's just like, yeah, I feel content. I think there's a bit of a motivational component to holding back. Like, if there's a big mountain to climb, you'll put a lot of energy into going towards it. And there might be a fear from some of the traditions that, like, well, if we're kind of really honest about this, people just might take drugs, they might not get into meditation. It's just like, I don't know if content is what I really want. I might want, something different, but I don't know, there's just some rambling thoughts. Currently, I've thought a lot about this. I did see your post and I really enjoyed reading it, and definitely suggest people should check that out. But that's kind of where I'm landing right now, is kind of pro truth, to the best of my ability. Is like, And okay, I know you might want to respond to that. So maybe I'll leave some space for a response, but I also wanted to circle back into this suffering thing. I thought what you said about enlightenment being the end of suffering was quite fascinating. So, do you have any kind of responses to what I was saying, or can we continue into looking at suffering a little more?
Yeah. Well, my dog's barking right now, and in the past, I would have resisted that, being like, "Oh, I'm in a podcast. You're not supposed to be barking," right? Say no, and then I'd feel a little anxiousness in my body, or a little stress, a little tension, and that's suffering,
Hmm.
even on a slight level. Like that subtle tension, or angst, or sense of whatever's happening right now isn't supposed to be happening, is like the root of suffering, really. And if I accept it and like, okay, my dog's name is Zen. Okay, Zen, you're a dog. You don't know any better. It's not personal. No big deal. I surrender into it and I accept it. It feels very peaceful because I'm no longer fighting reality. I'm just working with it. And I mean, this is just currently happening, but this is like the equation. Really, it just comes down to accepting. And also, this is really important, is when suffering arises, if the root of the suffering is resisting, what we don't realize we tend to do is when we become aware of suffering, we resist it. So we're adding a secondary layer to resistance. We're resisting resistance. And that is kind of what makes it worse. That's how it like digs into us, and it like really, finds a groove to hold on to, where the weakness of suffering is actually allowing or accepting. So when you become aware of suffering in you, when you can just, oh, okay, this is here right now. When there's just this sort of, oh, and this sort of okayness about it, it loses some of its sting. It loses some of its realness, its reality, and that's it, really. There's a really beautiful quote by Eckhart that what happens to unhappiness when you don't mind being unhappy? Which seems paradox, because who wants to be unhappy? But that's the ironic thing. When you stop resisting being unhappy, it loses its sting, and suddenly you realize like you can let it go a bit easier, or it just kind of goes by itself a bit easier. So that's an important thing I've found with suffering, is to recognize when I feel the resistance, and then to be okay with that in that moment, to acknowledge it, but then to just kind of be with it and be patient until it passes. It might pass in a few seconds. It might, if it's a strong pain body, it could last for a few hours, and that's okay too, because it's also important not to put expectation on it, but just because that isn't really acceptance. If I'm like, all right, I'm going to be with this discomfort for 10 minutes, I got 10 minutes, that's not really accepting, it's accepting with a little asterisk, and it's not how it works. Or a lot of times too, certain emotions will hit us in environments that we don't really want to deal with them in. Like, I don't know, let's say you're grocery shopping and you suddenly feel this hit of sadness, and you don't know where it's coming from or why, but part of you just wants to start crying, but you're like, oh no, I'm at a grocery store, I can't just start crying. Like there's something too about just really honoring when suffering arises in the moment. Why? Because it's happening in the present moment. Whatever's happening in the present moment is to be honored. And doing that very, very consistently, you start to heal a lot of these things. And they stop coming up. And then you're left with more peace, more contentment. Boredom. Boredom is something I used to have a lot of, and I realized over these last few years that like I don't really feel boredom anymore. I don't mind just sitting, doing nothing, which on the outside might look quite boring, but there's actually something very like satisfying about it. It's just you're just really enjoying being in the moment. It almost sounds cliche, but what I found too is it's almost like when I've taught myself or figured out or learned how to really appreciate just being, then everything else is lovely. Everything else is like um, icing on the cake, but the cake isn't any of those things. That's where we tend to project our happiness and our sense of like joy and excitement and feeling good, feeling alive into doing things, going out, hanging out with friends, even exercising or skateboarding or whatever the physical things are, watching movies and TV and eating delicious foods and whatever. And it's like so long as our sense of enjoyment is in the external reality, the form world, then it's subject to fluctuation. Our inner world is subject to fluctuation of feeling really good and then crashing and feeling really down, and this intense fluctuation. And that's one way I define how my journey's been is I stopped fluctuating as much. Um, well, there's a paradox there, because I'd say in some ways the highs have gotten higher, but the lows have gotten higher too, not lower.
Nice.
uh, yeah, yeah. I mean, I'm just really grateful, and I think gratitude is an important part of it as well. The claiming enlightenment thing, I think it's really important for everyone to sit with for themselves. There is a point in our journey where claiming enlightenment is the next step, and not claiming it is a game of the ego. Uh, and not feeling worthy, not feeling ready, not feeling whatever it is. At the same time, the ego is such a tricky thing, because we could also claim it too early and then be kind of ahead of be too far ahead of ourselves. And if you claim it too early, you end up with blind spots where you already think you get it all. You already think you understand everything. You already think you're very advanced, and yet there's suffering happening in your day-to-day life. Then it means you have blind spots. And the karma of that is that you're still suffering. So if you feel you're already at the end of suffering, and yet if somebody was following you around all day and they could point out every time you feel anxious or stressed or angry or whatever, you'd realize, oh shit, I'm not enlightened because I'm still suffering. That lack of being willing to see those spots, those blind spots, well, that's actually another way to define ego. It's just that lack of awareness. So the humility is very important, and something I held closely to for many years. And in fact, the only reason normally I wouldn't say it out loud that I'm enlightened, because it does seem to trigger things, but actually part of why I wanted to do it was more of a contemplation of like, what is best to help others, because I've been teaching and I've been creating content for many years, and it's moving progressively. People are starting to catch on more, appreciate it more, which is lovely, and they're enjoying what I'm sharing. But it's still slow too. It's growing very slowly. I mean, I started making YouTube videos in like 2014 or 15, and however many years later, I've got maybe 200 followers on YouTube. And so it's almost like, do people not see it? Like, do I have to just stand up and say, hey guys, I'm here, let me help you? I mean, there isn't. And that's kind of why I did it, was this contemplation of like, what if the more advanced practitioners, and by advanced I don't mean better by any means, it's not that type of comparison. It's just simply a recognition when somebody has a deeper practice. Like, to recognize Eckhart has a deeper practice than me is important. Otherwise, I'm not going to be willing to learn from him. It doesn't mean I feel inferior from him either. There's a big paradox there. But well, where was I going with that? Oh, yeah, just that, like, would it actually be more helpful for advanced practitioners to not be so quiet about the fruits of their practice, to be a little bit more like, hey, I experienced this lovely experience of life, and I want to help anyone that will listen. Do I need to wave a flag around saying that I'm able to, or do I do the old school way of just being very quiet about it, enjoying it, because that's really the gift of it. And whether somebody believes me or not doesn't make any difference.
Mhm.
I'm enjoying it constantly. I just happen to have this outward pull of wanting to share it, wanting to teach it. And so then there's that contemplation of like, well, really, what's most effective? What's going to save the most time here? Me doing it the old school way, or maybe trying something new and just kind of putting it out there. Um, Something though that actually was also important to me with that, when I declared that I was enlightened, one of the deep intentions of it too was that everyone's going to react or respond based on their experiences, right, and where they're at. Um, and so it actually gives more of a measure of where where you are at, when someone declares it, because what happens is like immediately the contemplation comes up of like, is that even possible? Or what is enlightenment? It brings up all these great questions like, wait, you know, okay, that's interesting, but who are you? Or what is enlightenment anyway? Or where am I on that spectrum? If if I feel so bold as to say that, oh, he's not enlightened, then I must know what it is. And if I don't know what it is, then admitting that I don't know what it is very helpful, very important. That's one next closer step to some, to this potentially lovely experience. And so that too was part of what I found to be a gift of that statement. Also, I'm I'm not a rule follower. I very much enjoy breaking the rules. There's a quote by Dalai Lama: "Know the rules well, so you can break them effectively."
Mm.
And I'd say that's part of my personality. I respect a lot of rules. I certainly, have I don't know, a code, I guess you could say, to varying degrees. But I push the boundaries, I push lines. I don't follow rules all the time. I don't necessarily fit the image of being spiritual either. If people really ask what I'm into outside of teaching spiritual stuff, you might be surprised that uh, I love Tool and Rage Against the Machine, and I smoke cannabis, and I do psychedelics here and there, and things that potentially people kind of put not as a these labels outside of what spiritual is supposed to look like or enlightenment is supposed to look like.
Mm.
And but the thing is too is you don't have to do any or all of that to be enlightened. It's like enlightenment is the fundamental. It looks different for everybody on the outside. On the inside, it feels the same. It feels very good. But on the outside, it can take many different angles or things. And so yeah, following rules isn't something I'm always doing. Or cussing. Cussing is one. It's a little one, but like people even that like I remember Eckhart had this talk, and he said the F word like out of nowhere, and it was so just refreshing, so lovely. I was like, yes. Because I grew up in like the Christian world, and there was just so many rules and so many things you're not supposed to do, and
Mm.
kind of constricting. You lose that sense of freedom. I think there's a delicate balance with true spiritual practice of freedom and discipline, uh, or self-mastery and freedom. Uh, yeah.
Thank you, Ryan. Thank you. A lot of really rich. What you're sharing is extremely rich. There was a lot there. A couple of things that I wanted to kind of pull out in summary was first about the declaration of being enlightenment, of being enlightened. How I received it, and from my experience, like myself, and also working with folks who are feeling a lot of suffering. So I think right now and this is very, we're recording this in 2022. Who knows when folks are watching this, but this feels to me like a very present moment thing, culturally, which is there's like a lot of meditation out there. There's a lot of, but there's also a lot of, for me, what I experience is like a cognitive dissonance in the fact that when we gather together in meditation, obviously, honestly, what a lot of us are coming in contact with is what you've called the pain body or suffering first. And there's a lot of pain. It's like, wait, don't the studies show like stress reduction or something? Like
Oh yeah.
what the hell is this? And so I think that it is important for hope, like to just be very, because there's like a marketing campaign, you know, bumping up meditation. And there's the lived experience of a pain body, and then there's like a thing that comes up there. And so I think the honest recognition, like this is a deep healing path, and you can come out the other side with, with peace, like abiding peace, and that is possible. And it's attainable. It's hard, but attainable. It's something that can be earned with practice. Is really important work that you're doing. And the last thing I wanted to say in summary was this idea. I think it's really quite fascinating. It's definitely a dance with me about kind of recognizing someone who's skilled at practice in a way that is not overly putting them on a pedestal or diminishing myself. And I've been thinking of it in a very kind of banal way recently. It's like if I wanted to learn how to build a table or make a new recipe, you just like ask like to learn that. There doesn't necessarily have to be this big like play of like, oh my God, teach me how to make this cake, or teach me. It's just like, oh, how'd you do that, man? That's so cool. Will you show me? And it can be this beautiful relationship that's actually very equal and connected and nice. But there's something about this spiritual thing, and maybe because there's so much hierarchy involved in religion, it doesn't necessarily have to be that. And that's just, I'll give you the shout out. And also someone I really like named Yungay Mingar Rinpoche, who I study. And there's just certain people like yourself and him that you can just learn from, and it doesn't feel like you don't feel that. And that I think is really interesting. So I appreciate that's a real gift that you've given us in the audience, and to some of your folks who are following your work. And I'm wondering, you've been extremely generous with your time, Ryan. So thank you for that. It's just flown by really fast, which is really cool. But is it okay? Can we ask you one more question before we say goodbye today?
Of course.
Okay. So my question is this. Shared a lot of your knowledge with us today, some very pragmatic practices, and you've talked a little bit about the work you do in the world, like sharing what you're doing with the world. If we wanted to kind of follow your work online or in person or however you're doing it, like where could we go to learn more about the teachings you're doing and the practices you're sharing, and how can we learn follow your work, Ryan?
Well, I have a website, ryanastheimer.com. But I kind of knew Astheimer is not an easy name to learn to spell and stuff. So I also got a domain that's ryanteachings.com. That was available. So you can just look up ryanteachings.com and my website will pop up. And it's got all my, it's got my YouTube. I have a lot of free content on YouTube. I do mentoring. I have a community gathering that meets every Sunday, and daily meditation space on Zoom, lots of stuff. So yeah, and one thing I want to try to do, as long as I can anyway, is be very reachable, very personal, or approachable, because I find a lot of these teachers, I guess maybe they just become so big that they're impossible to get in contact with, and it's something I really like to be on the front lines of my work. I don't want to be kind of in some other space. Who knows, if things get too big, I guess I have to adapt, but but for now, I'm very reachable. So please don't hesitate to message if you have questions or want to chat or do a Zoom chat or whatnot. I'd love to.
Great. Thank you for that, Ryan. Appreciate the generosity there. And we'll make sure to list the sources wherever you're finding this video. I'll make sure you can access them in an easy way. So Ryan, thanks again. Very grateful, very interesting conversation, and it really benefited me a lot, and I'm sure it will benefit others as well. So thank you very much for your time today, and good luck with all your teachings and offerings, and I'm glad you're sharing them with the world and helping to reduce some of the suffering we're going through. Thank you, Ryan.
Thank you, Brian.